as far as the details of this particular merger, can you explain why some people considered it anti-competitive in the long term, and what some of the particulars are as we talk through it?
Yeah. So number one, I think this is the correct quote unquote decision. And
Right.
number two, I think the worry and fears that some people in tech are expressing about this decision are completely valid and are something to pay attention to going forward. So I'll start with the first one. In popular conception, it's like, oh yeah, Figma, a Photoshop competitor. It's not a Photoshop competitor. Photoshop has way more capabilities, get way more deeper into sort of like design or whatever of or Illustrator or whatever sort of your Adobe tool of choice. The difference is all these Adobe tools, they started in this world of personal computers and they were personal applications. You had a file, you would work on it, and then you would, and then you were done, and you would put that file, one of the big innovations was like shared network drives where everyone can have access to the file. But then you'd get into these crazy, sort of like append your V1, V2, V3, V3045 with, AS. You're a former lawyer. You've sort of lived this life as far as like passing back and forth.
A lot of Microsoft Word documents, V6, V7, V8. Yeah, it's
right.
Great.
And so this was very much the case in design as well. And so basically, all of Adobe's products have been a single player game. It's like you go in, you use their product, and they've generally been licensed on a single player basis. You had an individual license. And, one of the big shifts over time has been sort of the rise of collaboration, the idea of lots of folks working on one thing. And Adobe's products were fundamentally not collaborative. And so that's number one. Number two, there was this new space, which is, call it interaction design. This idea, like when you're building it, say you're building an app, the number of screens, even in a simple iPhone app, is like shockingly large, right? Like say there's like 50 possible screens or 500 possible screens. You have every possible permutation, go into every setting, go into every sort of single thing. That needs a team to design, and it needs a team to build. You're going to have the designers, you're going to have the engineers, you have the product managers, you have the client that is reviewing it, or the CEO, or whatever it might be. And it's a fundamentally sort of collaborative sort of thing. Now but first off, as far as this design thing, you had a company called Sketch a few years ago that came out on macOS, and they blew up with the iPhone because you had all this new sort of designs that were sort of happening. That was also a single player game. It was sort of one person now had this application that was not Photoshop. It wasn't that heavy, but it had it was lighter as far as its capabilities, but it was designed for designing sort of interactive experiences. So Sketch is there, but again, it still had the collaboration point where Sketch files were V1, V2, V3, V4, V5. And ideally over time they'd be in the cloud, but still it was always sort of a hack. Figma comes along, and Figma is a fascinating company for lots of reasons. One of them is which it took them like 2 years or something, maybe 3 years to launch the first version of their product. Why? Because the fundamental technology of like undergirding sort of like the web is kind of crappy, right? It's like actually the key innovation, you mentioned the Microsoft Netscape bit, was Microsoft introduced this capability that lets you update the page in place. And that was not a web standard. They just introduced it in part because it was useful, but also to kind of screw around with this market. And pages that use this as like, I can't remember what it's called, XML, blah, 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 HTTP access or something like that. They would only work in Internet Explorer. It wouldn't work sort of in other browsers. But they did that. They also did ActiveX, which was proprietary. But this particular request, someone came along, I think it was Brandon Ike, with sort of like with Netscape or Firefox, and they realized you could use this to update sort of the page in place. And basically the whole JavaScript sort of revolution of these web apps where you could go to Google Docs, or you could go to any web application, and the page will change based on your input or based on your action. This is all using a scripting language or a language called JavaScript that is sort of being composed real time in your browser. And that's how we got the whole world of web apps, was actually through Microsoft kind of trying to screw Navigator back in the day and putting this capability in that became sort of a web standard by backdoor, by sort of accident. Anyhow, yes, it's a pile of hacks. What Figma did is they spent 2 or 3 years building their own rendering engine. So basically what happens is when you go to Figma, it basically doesn't use like the core browser stuff. It's like they like insert their rendering thing that's super high performant that will work across browsers. And so you can actually have an interactive experience with design elements that feels like a desktop application. It's a remarkable story. Like it is like the ultimate, what's called a fat startup, where they didn't get a minimum viable product out there and iterate on that, right? That's sort of like the sort of lean method or whatever it is. No, they spent years on hardcore computer science, building this fundamental capability upon which they could have sort of Figma. So, all the credit in the world to them for doing that. But what they built was this interactive design application that was inherently collaborative because it was built for the web, right? You don't have to have everyone install Figma and try to sync changes across things and all this sort of weird stuff that we still deal with Microsoft Word or where it might be. You opened the page in your browser and you could work on it. Everyone could work on it because all the work was actually happening in the cloud. It wasn't happening sort of on your device. And so by being collaborative from day one, it has swept the industry because it solved this massive pain point, which was you had this category of applications around designing web pages and designing applications. That Sketch was there, but it was a single player game. Adobe came out with XD, XD was pursuing Sketch, and Adobe is a single game mindset company. And so it's a one-player thing. Figma comes out here, blows the doors off all of them because it's collaboration from day one. It was built in from the core. And so the challenge for Adobe is not that they killed XD. XD wasn't that important to it. It made no real difference to Adobe's bottom line. The issue is that if you have an application that is inherently collaborative, that undergirds from Figma, you might open an image and then work on it in Photoshop or work on it in Illustrator or work on it in whatever sort of design program of your choice. But then it goes back into Figma because that's the connective tissue for an entire company that is building something, that is designing something. It's the analogy I make to it is it's the operating system of design. It's the core piece that everything else plugs into. Just like Windows used to be the operating system that mattered for business. And then what has Microsoft done with Teams that's so impressive? Teams sucks as a chat app. What it does is everything plugs into it, right? You can share a link there. It'll open in the right place. You'll have a list. All the files are associated with it. The files are in the cloud and all that sort of thing. It's the central hub around which stuff is organized. And when you're the central hub, you have power in that value chain. That power, it could be monetary. It could be like Figma can improve their capabilities to make Photoshop less and less necessary. They could favor or have a marketplace. They do have a marketplace where they promote maybe a Photoshop alternative and say, this is actually a better deal. It's cheaper and it works natively with Figma, sort of XYZ. So the issue here is not that the XD was really kind of a failed product, but obviously, that kind of gave the game away that Adobe immediately sort of sunset XD. But that to me is less important than the fact that Figma was threatening to Adobe, the entity. Now, Adobe's tried to make their stuff more collaborative. They have the Creative Cloud. They want to sync all this stuff together, but they're a pile of hacks built up on a single player game. Figma is fundamentally disruptive in that it's approaching it from it's starting collaboration first. It's just different than what Adobe does. And that is a threat to Adobe in the long run. So in this case, I think a narrow view of this case, and Adobe's bet was on a narrow view that regulators would say, yeah, it's not competitive with Photoshop. It's not competitive with Illustrator. XD was already a failed product. This is not a competitive product. They wanted it to be seen as one of many products, and then they can acquire it. In this case, a sophisticated view, which I encourage, this is like the Microsoft Activision thing, right? In a narrow sense, you can understand the pushback. My point was you have to look at it holistically. You have to look at it in the context of consoles. You have to look at it in the context of PCs. You have to look at it in the context of the games market as a whole. In this case, a holistic view is that Adobe is worried about being holistically screwed because they're just like a plug-in for what actually matters. And because of that, I think this is an appropriate sort of this is a merger that should not have happened. Figma is very competitive with Adobe. It's a big problem for Adobe, and Adobe should not be able to solve it by buying them off.